The wind howled across the open plains. The rivers carved their way through deep valleys, and the towering mountains stood like silent guardians of the land. Long before the United States of America became the country we know today, this land was home to great civilizations. Native American tribes lived here for thousands of years, each with their own customs, languages, and ways of life. Some built large villages, others traveled with the seasons, hunting buffalo or fishing in clear waters. They understood the land, respected it, and called it home. But change was coming. One day, strange ships appeared on the horizon. They were unlike anything seen before, large wooden vessels with white sails that filled with the wind. The people aboard these ships had crossed the vast Atlantic Ocean, leaving behind their homes in Europe in search of something new. Some came for wealth, some for freedom, and others simply to escape a difficult life. They landed on the shores of this unknown world, stepping onto a land that was both beautiful and unforgiving. They did not know what awaited them. At first, life was harsh. The winters were bitterly cold, food was scarce, and sickness spread quickly. Many settlers did not survive their first year, but those who did learn to adapt. Some made peace with the Native American tribes, trading goods and learning how to grow food in this new land. Others, however, brought conflict. Slowly, small wooden towns turned into larger settlements, and by the 1600s, 13 colonies stretched along the eastern coast. Life in these colonies was not easy, but it was full of promise. People worked hard, farming the land, building ships, and trading with Europe. The cities of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia grew, their streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, and families trying to build a better future. But as the years passed, a new feeling began to spread among the colonists: resentment. They were ruled by a king thousands of miles away in Britain, a king who taxed them heavily but gave them no say in their own laws. This was not the freedom they had dreamed of. Then something changed. In the year 1776, a group of men gathered in Philadelphia. They wrote a document that would shake the world: the Declaration of Independence. In it, they declared that all people had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was a bold statement, one that challenged the power of the British Empire. War was now unavoidable. The fight for independence was long and brutal. Ordinary farmers and shopkeepers took up weapons against one of the most powerful armies in the world. They fought in the cold, through hunger, and against impossible odds. There were victories, but there were also devastating losses. Towns burned, families were torn apart, and the fate of the colonies hung in the balance. But in the end, after years of battle, the impossible happened. The colonies won. The United States of America was born. But victory was only the beginning. A new country needed rules, leaders, and a system to keep order. Great minds like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin came together to create something that had never been tried before: a government of the people, by the people, for the people. They wrote the Constitution, a document that would shape the nation and guide its future. As the young nation grew, so did its challenges. People moved west, looking for new land and new opportunities, but this expansion brought conflict. Native American tribes were forced from their homes, and tensions between different parts of the country grew stronger. The biggest divide of all was over slavery. The northern states, where industries and cities thrived, wanted to end slavery. The southern states, where large plantations depended on enslaved labor, refused to give it up. This disagreement grew into something far bigger, a crisis that threatened to tear the nation apart. By 1861, war had erupted. The Civil War was one of the darkest chapters in American history. Brothers fought against brothers, cities turned to rubble, and the country nearly collapsed. The war lasted 4 long years, ending only when the Southern forces surrendered. Slavery was finally abolished, but the wounds of the war ran deep. The country had survived, but the battle for equality and justice was far from over. In the years that followed, America entered a period of rebuilding and growth. Railroads connected distant cities, factories brought new jobs, and immigrants arrived from all over the world. People from Ireland, Italy, China, and beyond, all hoping for a fresh start. America became a land of opportunity, but it was not without its struggles. Discrimination, economic hardship, and political conflicts continued to shape the nation's story. Despite the hardships, the United States pushed forward. It entered a new era of invention and industry. The railroad stretched from factories filled the cities, their smokestacks painting the sky with thick clouds of soot. Railroads stretched across the vast land, connecting people and industries like never before. Immigrants poured into the country, arriving at Ellis Island in New York, their eyes filled with hope and fear. Some came from Ireland, escaping famine. Others arrived from Italy, Germany, or Eastern Europe, searching for work and a new beginning. In the West, Chinese laborers built railroads through treacherous mountains, carving paths that would unite the country. But while America was growing, it was also changing in ways that made many uneasy. The cities became crowded, streets filled with horse-drawn carriages, street vendors, and workers rushing to their jobs. People lived packed into small apartments, entire families sharing a single room. Some found fortune in the booming industries, but for many, life was a daily struggle. Factory workers labored in dangerous conditions, children worked long hours, and wages were barely enough to survive. The rich grew richer, building grand mansions and controlling powerful businesses, while the poor fought to stay afloat. The gap between the two widened, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. In the South, life was just as difficult, but for different reasons. The scars of the Civil War had not healed. Formerly enslaved people were now free, but true freedom was still out of reach. Many were forced to work for the same plantation owners, trapped in a system that kept them in poverty. Laws were passed to keep them from voting, from owning land, from having a real voice in the country they had helped build. The promise of equality seemed far away, and tension continued to grow. At the same time, America's expansion westward was unstoppable. Towns sprang up overnight, but so did violence. Outlaws roamed the open plains, robbing trains and stagecoaches. Lawmen chased them, but justice was slow and unpredictable. Native American tribes, pushed further and further off their lands, fought back, but the United States Army was relentless. One by one, the battles ended, and the land once belonging to generations of native peoples was now claimed by settlers, ranchers, and railroads. The West had been won, but at what cost? As the 20th century dawned, the world outside America's borders was changing as well. Conflicts in Europe threatened to pull the young nation into war. Factories produced weapons, young men signed up for the military, and newspapers filled with stories of battles happening thousands of miles away. At first, the United States tried to stay out of it, but war had a way of drawing everyone in. Soon, American soldiers were boarding ships, heading into a conflict unlike any the world had ever seen. But even as war raged abroad, the battles at home continued. Women who had worked tirelessly in factories and offices while men were away fighting began demanding more rights. They wanted the right to vote, to have a say in the country's future. Protesters filled the streets, newspapers debated the issue, and after years of struggle, change finally came. The world was shifting, but not everyone welcomed it. With each step forward, new challenges arose. A booming economy in the 1920s gave people hope, but the Great Depression soon followed, bringing hardship and desperation. Banks collapsed, jobs disappeared, and families lost everything. People lined up for food. Once wealthy businessmen found themselves with nothing, and the government scrambled to find solutions. It was a time of uncertainty, of struggle, and of resilience. Then came another war, one even greater than the last. This time, the entire world was at stake. The United States once again sent soldiers across the ocean, fighting in the cold fields of Europe and the tropical islands of the Pacific. Back home, factories worked day and night, producing planes, tanks, and supplies. Every American played a role, whether on the battlefield or in the factories. Victory eventually came, but it came with a price. Millions had died, cities had been destroyed, and a new kind of weapon, the atomic bomb, had changed warfare forever. As soldiers returned home, the world entered a new era, one filled with both hope and fear. The United States had become a global power, but with that power came responsibility and new conflicts. Tensions with other nations grew, a silent war of ideas and technology known as the Cold War. Spies operated in the shadows, governments built stockpiles of weapons, and the world watched, wondering if peace would hold. At the same time, the fight for justice continued within America. Segregation, discrimination, and inequality still plagued the country. Black Americans, led by brave individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., marched for their rights, demanding the freedom and equality promised long ago. Their struggle was met with violence, resistance, and hardship, but they refused to back down. The nation stood at a crossroads. On one side, progress, new inventions, space exploration, medical advancements. On the other, division, political tensions, racial conflicts, and economic uncertainty. Would the United States continue to rise, or would its struggles tear it apart? The story was far from over. The choices made in the coming years would shape the country's future, for better or worse. The road ahead was uncertain, and history was still being written. The country stood on the edge of a new era, but the weight of its past still pressed down. The civil rights movement grew stronger, and the streets of America became battlegrounds for justice. Marches filled the cities, voices rose in unison, and signs demanding freedom and equality were held high. But with every step forward, there was resistance. Police cracked down on protesters, leaders were threatened, and violence erupted in places where change was feared the most. Still, the movement did not stop. The nation watched as young students refused to leave segregated lunch counters, as brave men and women walked across bridges despite the threat of attack, as the dream of a better America stood against the forces trying to keep it divided. The tension reached a breaking point. Speeches echoed across the country, some filled with hope, others with anger. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words rang out like a promise for a better tomorrow, but his life, like so many others, was cut short. A bullet, a moment of silence, then an outpouring of grief and rage. Cities burned, people wept, and the country felt as if it might split apart once again. Would the dream survive, or would it fade into history like so many before it? As the fight for equality raged on, the world itself was shifting in dangerous ways. The Cold War had turned into something more than just whispered secrets and silent threats. The fear of nuclear war loomed over everything, as two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood locked in a dangerous standoff. Missiles were aimed, fingers hovered over buttons, and the world held its breath, wondering if this was the moment history would end. The war in Vietnam only added to the tension. Young American soldiers, many barely out of high school, were sent across the ocean to fight in a war that seemed to have no clear purpose. They trudged through thick jungles, faced enemies they could not see, and questioned why they were there at all. Back home, the war was tearing the country apart. Protests filled the streets, families were divided, and the government's promises no longer felt like truths. When the war finally ended, it left deep scars on those who fought, on those who lost loved ones, and on a nation that no longer knew what to believe. But there were victories too, moments that reminded people that America was still a land of possibilities. A man walked on the moon, proving that human ambition knew no limits. Technology advanced, connecting people in ways never seen before. Music, art, and culture thrived, reflecting both the pain and the hope of a generation searching for meaning. Yet with each new success, new conflicts arose. The economy faced crises, industries collapsed, and families struggled to make ends meet. Scandals shook the government, and trust in leadership crumbled. The streets once again filled with protests against war, against corruption, against injustice that refused to die. The years passed, and the country continued to evolve. The internet arrived, connecting the world at the speed of light. Towers rose high above the cities, symbols of wealth and power. But even as America moved forward, the divisions never truly disappeared. New challenges replaced old ones, new leaders promised change, and yet the same questions remained. Now standing at the edge of a new century, the world watched as America faced its greatest test yet. The choices made now would define the future. Would the nation learn from its past, or would history repeat itself? The tension had reached its peak, and the world was waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The story of America was far from over, but what would happen next? The nation stood on shaky ground, its foundation tested by time, conflict, and change. It had survived wars, economic crashes, and social upheaval, but something felt different now. The divisions, once hidden beneath the surface, had begun to crack open again, exposing wounds that had never fully healed. The promise of unity was still there, written in the country's history, but so was the weight of past mistakes. And now, as the world moved faster than ever before, those mistakes threatened to repeat themselves. Technology had reshaped daily life, connecting people across the globe in an instant. The internet had once been a tool of discovery, but now it had become something more, a battlefield of ideas, a place where truth and fiction blurred together. Misinformation spread like wildfire, fueling anger, deepening divides, and making it harder to know who or what to trust. The country, so proud of its freedom of speech, now found itself struggling with the consequences. Every event, every crisis, every word spoken by leaders was dissected, twisted, and used to feed an ever-growing storm of uncertainty. At the same time, the world itself was changing in ways that no one could ignore. Climate disasters struck with increasing force, hurricanes stronger than before, wildfires consuming entire towns, droughts stretching on for years. The country had built cities, industries, and fortunes, but now the very land beneath them seemed to rebel. Scientists warned of a future that could not be ignored, but as with everything else, the issue became a fight. Some believed in the warnings, pushing for urgent action. Others dismissed them, refusing to change a system that had made the nation strong. As these tensions grew, an unexpected challenge emerged, one that no one had truly been prepared for. A crisis that did not come in the form of war or economic collapse, but something invisible, something that spread silently through crowded streets and quiet homes. A pandemic swept across the world, changing life overnight. Businesses closed, hospitals filled, and the fear of an unseen enemy gripped the country. People stayed inside, watching helplessly as the numbers climbed higher. It was a test unlike any other, a battle not fought with weapons, but with patience, resilience, and trust. But trust was in short supply. Instead of uniting, the country found itself more divided than ever. Some believed in science, in the experts who worked tirelessly to find solutions. Others saw conspiracy, questioning every decision, every restriction, every piece of advice. The fight was no longer just against the virus, it was against each other. And as months passed, the damage was done. Lives were lost, businesses collapsed, and the country was left with yet another deep scar, another chapter in its long and complicated history. But as the nation tried to recover, something else lurked beneath the surface, waiting to explode. Old wounds, racial injustice, economic inequality, political corruption had not disappeared. Protests erupted once again, cities filled with voices demanding change. The echoes of past movements were there, but this time the stakes felt even higher. The country was at a tipping point. The weight of its past, the struggles of its present, and the uncertainty of its future all collided, leaving one question unanswered. What would happen next? The country stood at a breaking point, its future hanging in the balance. The weight of history pressed down, and the choices made now would shape what came next. Protests filled the streets, voices rose, and the nation seemed more divided than ever. But then something unexpected happened. Amid all the chaos, people began to listen. Not just to those who agreed with them, but to those they had once seen as enemies. Conversations that had once ended in anger now continued, sometimes with hesitation, sometimes with pain, but they continued. The divisions had not disappeared, and the wounds had not healed overnight, but there was a shift. Small at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Communities that had been torn apart by conflict started rebuilding, not just physically, but emotionally. Neighbors who had once ignored each other's struggles now reached out. Leaders, once too afraid to act, began making decisions that put people before politics. The past could not be erased, but perhaps it could be learned from. Technology, which had once fueled division, began to be used in new ways. It connected people not through anger, but through shared experiences, shared struggles, shared hopes. A new generation, raised in the shadow of past mistakes, stepped forward with fresh ideas, determined to build something better. They did not ignore the past, but they refused to be trapped by it. But just as hope seemed within reach, the final twist came. A discovery, one that would shake the nation's very foundation. Hidden deep within old government archives, a long-buried secret was uncovered. A truth about the country's past, one that had been forgotten or deliberately erased. Historians, journalists, and citizens alike struggled to make sense of it. What did it mean? Who had known? And most importantly, how would the country move forward now, knowing what had been kept in the dark for so long? The revelation did not break the country, but it did force a reckoning. The final test was not about war, disease, or political battles. It was about truth. Could the nation face itself, accept its past, and still move forward? The answer was not clear. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like the country was ready to find out. The story of America was not over. It was only turning the page to its next chapter. The truth, long buried and forgotten, had finally come to light. At first, it caused shock, disbelief, and anger. People questioned how something so significant had been hidden for so long. Some refused to accept it, while others felt vindicated, as if the weight of generations had finally been acknowledged. The country stood still, staring at the pages of its own past, unsure of what to do next. But then something changed. Instead of pushing it aside, people began to confront it. It wasn't easy. Accepting hard truths never is. But the conversation had begun. Leaders, historians, and everyday citizens debated what this revelation meant for the future. Would it divide the country even further, or could it serve as a moment of reckoning, a chance to grow? Schools added new lessons to their history books, making sure that future generations wouldn't be left in the dark. Families sat together at dinner tables, discussing the past in ways they never had before. It wasn't about rewriting history, it was about finally seeing it in full. As the country processed the truth, something unexpected happened. The divisions that had seemed impossible to bridge just years before started to shift. Not completely, not suddenly, but in small ways that mattered. People began to realize that no single person or group had all the answers. That their struggles, though different, were connected. The country had spent so long arguing about who was right and who was wrong that it had forgotten to listen. Now, for the first time in a long time, people were starting to hear each other. The economy, once in turmoil, slowly found its footing again. New industries emerged, jobs returned, and communities that had been abandoned were rebuilt with new purpose. Technology, which had once fueled so much division, became a tool for education and connection. Misinformation still existed, but people became more aware, questioning what they saw instead of simply accepting it. A new generation of leaders rose, not just in politics, but in business, in activism, in everyday life. They were shaped by the struggles of their time, determined to do things differently. The scars of the past did not disappear, but they became lessons instead of open wounds. People still disagreed because in a country as vast and diverse as the United States, disagreement was inevitable. But the difference was that now, more people were willing to have real conversations, rather than just shouting across the divide. There was no perfect ending, no sudden moment where everything was fixed. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the strength of the country had never been about being perfect. Maybe as the 20th century arrived, America faced new challenges on a global scale. It fought in 2 world wars, endured the Great Depression, and witnessed powerful movements for civil rights and equality. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks stood against injustice, demanding a better future. Technology changed the way people lived, from the invention of the airplane to the rise of the internet. Through triumph and tragedy, war and peace, the United States continued to evolve. Today, it remains a country of great diversity, innovation, and resilience. But history is never truly finished. The story of America is still being written by its people, its leaders, and the choices made every day. So how did this one nation rise from a group of struggling colonies to one of the most powerful countries in the world? And what lessons can we learn from its past? That is the story we are about to explore. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the history of the United States. One moment, one struggle, and one triumph at a time. The United States was now a nation, but what kind of nation would it become? The ink on the Constitution was barely dry, yet the country was already facing its first great tests. People were eager to move west, searching for land, fortune, and a new beginning. They packed their belongings into wagons and set out on dangerous journeys across mountains, deserts, and endless plains. Some traveled in search of gold, hoping to strike it rich in California. Others wanted farmland, a place to build homes and raise families. But the land they sought was not empty. Native American tribes had lived there for generations, and they were not willing to give up their homes without a fight. Conflicts broke out, some small, some devastating. Treaties were made and broken. The United States government pushed forward, determined to expand, no matter the cost. Railroads were built, connecting the East to the West. Towns sprang up overnight, and the country's borders stretched further and further. But not everyone shared in this progress. Many Native American communities were forced onto reservations, their way of life forever changed. And as the nation grew, so did the divide between the North and the South. Slavery had been part of American society since the early days of the colonies, but now it was tearing the country apart. The South depended on slavery to keep its large plantations running, while the North was moving toward industry, factories, and wage labor. Arguments erupted in Congress, in newspapers, and in homes across the country. Could the United States survive if half the nation believed in freedom and the other half believed in slavery? Tensions reached their breaking point in 1861 when several Southern states decided they no longer wanted to be part of the Union. They declared their independence, forming the Confederate States of America. The North refused to accept this, and war broke out. It was a war that would test the strength of the young nation like never before. The battlefield stretched from Virginia to Tennessee, from Pennsylvania to Georgia. Entire towns were destroyed, families were torn apart, and the death toll climbed higher and higher. President Abraham Lincoln, a man who had once been just a simple lawyer from Illinois, now carried the weight of the country on his shoulders. He believed the Union must stay together, that slavery must end, and that the United States could not be divided. But his enemies were strong, and the war seemed endless. Soldiers faced hunger, disease, and exhaustion. The fate of the country hung by a thread. After 4 long years, the North finally claimed victory, and slavery was abolished. The war was over, but the wounds remained. The South lay in ruins, its economy shattered. Newly freed people faced an uncertain future. They had freedom, but what did that really mean? Could they find jobs, own land, or vote? Would they be truly equal? The country struggled to answer these questions, and deep divisions remained.